Go.
Well, terrific. So I'm delighted to be chairing this session. And we have three excellent presentations that address various issues around work and experimentation. So I'm going to read, I'm Rose Batt, I'm from the ILR school, and I'm chairing this session, and I'm going to read the presenters in order, and then I won't read their names and titles again. But the first is Cassie Bowkett and Christian Levesque on institutional experimentation in the aerospace industry, comparing Montreal and Toronto clusters. Then Mathieu, Dupuis, Gregor, Murray, and Meiyun doing a paper on digital transformation and institutional experimentation in automotive services. And then Mathieu and Greer doing a study comparing North American auto industry, local union experimentation in insourcing and what the corporate politics of that look like. So I'm going to, each presenter has 13 minutes. I'm going to give you in your chat box a notice at 10 minutes. So that'll give you then 3 minutes to go. And then I'll give you a time at 1 minute and then we'll be going. Yes, so take it away, Cassie.
Thanks so much. Let me just get my presentation loaded. Let's have a look here. So hopefully this should now be able to see my presentation. Let's just load that up. Okay, so my presentation is going to be looking at a comparison of the Montreal and Toronto aerospace clusters. So I'm going to, because it's short and I don't want to run out of time, I'm going to give you my key findings first and then go into the detail underneath that. So the Toronto and Montreal aerospace clusters are the two largest aerospace manufacturing clusters in Canada. They make up 81% of aerospace manufacturing activity, but they have two very different institutional legacies. So in the Montreal cluster, we have thick institutions, polyarchic governance structure with some centralization, a top-heavy supply chain structure, and a dispersal of power, including the involvement of unions. In the Toronto cluster, in comparison, we have institutions, the historical dominance of one original equipment manufacturer, Bombardier, and fragmented governance. So what we see in both clusters is the same pressure to adopt the new exponential technologies such as Industry 4.0. We see very similar reporting of challenges, the implementation challenges, skill challenges that firms face in doing so and the associated impacts. But what we find in our research project is that the Montreal cluster, because it has thicker institutions, not only is it able to engage in experimental initiatives, but it is able to actually embed these experiments and transform them into institutional resources. So it's able to move the production of private goods into the production of collective and even public goods. What we find in the Toronto cluster in comparison is that with the thinner institutions that firms in collaboration with other actors do engage in experimentation, we see a big struggle in terms of embedding the efforts of this experimentation. So what we find there is mostly organizational level experimentation. Okay, so whistle-stop tour. So Industry 4.0 is the virtualization of manufacturing. So we're looking effectively at the project very briefly on what Industry 4.0 is, how it's implemented, and what the impact is on firms and skills. So our theoretical perspective on skills is that skills are a collective good. We argue that based on Crouch et al, that it's an impure public good because of its non-excludable and rival nature. Employers invariably invest in skill development. And so the impacts and the future skill needs driven by technological developments such as Industry 4.0 require collective solutions. And we're looking at the role of regional institutions in this process. So we draw on the concepts of organizational and institutional experimentation and the notion of thick versus thin institutions, drawing on Amin and Thrift's 4 factors of institutional thickness. Okay, so research methods, 110 interviews have been done in the Montreal case over the course of a decade, 31 in Toronto over the course of the last 2 years, with all of the key actors in the cluster across all different actor groups. Okay, so the key characteristics of the Montreal Aerospace cluster, I'm going to go through these very quickly. It's a dense production network. We see government support at both federal and provincial levels, and the provincial government support in the Montreal case is really important. They've given a lot of money over the years. They've continued funding organizations that were established under federal funding, CAMAC being one of those. We see a complex institutional architecture. So for training, we have the establishment of CAMAC, which is a joint union management sectorial committee that promotes aerospace related skill development for the region. We see CREAC, who is responsible for research and development initiatives, and particularly collaborative research and development initiatives, multi-firm with universities, colleges, and other stakeholders. And we see the establishment in 2006 of Aero Montreal, who is one of the major decision makers in the cluster and a key strategic body in terms of generating a regional dialogue between various actors. Importantly, we also have a well-organized education system, and we have a strong union presence. And the union presence is really important. It is both at the shop floor level, where there's a high level of union density in the sector, but we also see union participation in each of the organizations I just mentioned. So they are very important within CAMAC at a governance level. They have a seat at the table in the governance structures of Aero Montreal and CREAC. So unions play a really important role in the cluster. In comparison, if we go to the Toronto cluster, we have an old and specialized cluster. We see same levels of support for federal government, but far less consistent support at a provincial level. So one of the main issues is a lack of resources, mainly government funding. We also see a much thinner institutional architecture. So a lot of the institutions that I'm about to refer to have been set up in the last decade. We have one, which is the Sector Trade Association. The Ontario Aerospace Consortium was established in 1993, but has regularly reported limited resources in terms of both personnel and financing. We've also seen the establishment of the Ontario Manufacturing Learning Consortium, which is an organization that was set up as an initiative of 3 major firms in the cluster and in partnership with the OAC, which is designed to offer initial training for machinists and structural assemblers. And we've seen also the establishment of 3 other organizations in relation to innovation funding. CARIC is the provincial arm of innovation funding, but has been since defunded. There's the Supercluster Initiative, but it's not sector specific. That's just been set up in 2019. And we have a private consortium, the DARE Consortium, which is a collaboration and firms centered around the Downsview cluster in Toronto. We also have a dense network of colleges and universities in the cluster. And this is another major difference, is union presence in Toronto is much lower. So we see much lower union density. We see a number of shop floors of large firms that are not unionized. And the unions play almost no role. They have no seat at the table at any of the sector institutions I just talked through. They don't have a seat at the board of any of the innovation bodies or the Sector Trade Association. Okay, so this is, one of the things we've tried to do in comparing the sectors is to use the framework of thick institutions to try and explain the differences in terms of how both regional clusters are responding and supporting firms through Industry 4.0 adoption. So we see, in terms of institutional and organizational presence, in the Montreal cluster, we see a higher number of organizations. Well-resourced, high amount of trade union presence, and as a result, we see the development of a number of collective goods generated by the regional institutions and in collaboration with firms. So we see a lot of innovation projects that are generated through CREAC collaboratively across multiple firms horizontally in this, within the cluster. We see the establishment of both formal and informal routes for SME networking. For example, we see the establishment of skills and training programs that are available as a public or collective good for firms in the sector. And we see the emergence of specific collective goods related to Industry 4.0 adoption. One example would be a program targeting supporting SMEs through the implementation of Industry 4.0 called the MACFAB program offered by Montreal. In Toronto, we see, first of all, there are less organizations. We see this a struggle for ongoing resources in the organizations that do exist, lower trade union presence, and as a result, we see the emergence of initiatives that are attempting to provide collective goods. So the DARE initiative was designed to try and encourage collaborative innovation projects between firms of all sizes within the sector. Similar kind of initiative with the supercluster, and the Ontario Manufacturing Learning Consortium was set up to allow firms to share the costs of training for occupations where they were reporting significant shortages, such as in machinists or structural assemblers. But we see a real issue in terms of being able to fund and replicate the production of these collective goods, so they're not institutionalized. In terms of interaction, again, we see quite a difference. There's a high level of high density of interaction and intensity of interaction in the Montreal cluster. It occurs at vertical levels in the supply chain and horizontal amongst competitive firms. It occurs between firms, trade unions, and other organizations in multiple different forms. And we also see the emergence of what we've termed regulative devices to foster cooperation and channel conflict. So as an example, CAMAC set up firm site visits among SMEs as a way of peer-to-peer sharing of best practice. And one of the things that this did was it built trust relationships between SME managers. It operated as a device to sort of channel conflict. So these individual managers built relationships with each other. They felt comfortable sharing best practice. And so these networks are now being used to share information about Industry 4.0, the challenges that firms are facing, how they go about implementing the different technologies. And so it's fostering collaboration and channeling conflict in a way. And we also see formal programs like designed to support SMEs or via intra-firm university collaboration organized by CREAC that actually formally channel conflict through formal contracts. In Toronto, we see a lower density and intensity of interaction. So it mostly occurs at a vertical level within the supply chain. There's very little horizontal regulation. We have very few regulative devices. And so what we see as a result is conflict at a firm-to-firm level through poaching, whether deliberate or sort of not deliberate, but it just seems to occur. It's regularly reported by firms. In terms of the structures of domination, Montreal has a polyarchic historically form of governance. We do see some movement towards hegemonic centralization, with Montreal seeking to control the decision-making process. But this is under conflict. This is an emerging issue. Other firms, other organizations such as CAMAC are pushing to keep their own autonomy and to keep the polyarchic governance structure, and they're supported by the union as it's an important space where the union can contribute and have a say about key issues such as skills in relation to Industry 4.0. In Toronto, we don't see the same struggles here because the government structure is so fragmented. And finally, in terms of common agendas, in Montreal, we see several emerging around labour shortages, skills upgrading, technological upgrading. So they are emerging, and obviously various collective goods and resources for the cluster emerge alongside those. In Toronto, we see a few starting to emerge around innovation and skills. So the DARE and the DARE project and the OMLC were set up as a result of these, and some at a firm level within the supply chain, but they're very, very embryonic. So just very, very briefly, both clusters are facing the same challenges in terms of Industry 4.0 adoption and skills. We see the same variation across firms. Some are not even started the process. Some are at the very beginning stages. They're purchasing robots and ERP systems. Or, some are at more advanced stages and are deploying software deployment and connecting machines, running data collection. And some firms are actually running a virtual factory. But what we do see is the same issues coming up. So we see issues in relation to management capacity, so struggles for SMEs, particularly in relation to being able to develop strategies related to Industry 4.0 adoption. And we also see issues emerging in terms of changing of the existing roles and skill sets, new roles such as data specialists emerging, and pressure about the continued need for existing skills and broader issue of labour and skill shortages in the sector. So, as I've said, and I'm going to very quickly sum up because I know I'm a little bit over. The Montreal case, we see this thick institutional setting, the ability to institutionalize programs, and a case of institutional experimentation, whereas in Toronto, we see thin, though thickening institutional setting, much greater difficulty in institutionalizing their experimental endeavors and more forms of organizational experimentation. And apologies for running a little bit over, and I'll hand back to Rose.
Rose, you need your mic.
You were perfect. I was not. We'll move on to Mathieu and Gregor and Meiyun Wu on digital transformations. Take it away. Thank you so much.
Hi there, and Mathieu is using the screen, and hopefully you can see it at the same time. Mathieu, if you want to go down 2 slides, and then we'll pick up just for speed's sake.
Okay. Do you hear me right now?
Yeah. So we can skip this one too.
Okay. This one?
That's perfect. That's where we can start. So we pick up very nicely, I think, from Cassie, and this is a joint work by Meiyun, Mathieu, and myself, who are deeply entrenched in the auto services industry in a way we never thought would be possible. It was a perfect team where no one had a car until Meiyun and her husband went and got a car, so that really ruined things, but we'll get over that. So here we are in an industry where we're basically talking about selling cars, maintaining cars, fixing cars, distributing parts for cars. And the story is how fault lines, technology, globalization, and competitive restructuring disrupt the regulation of skills, working conditions, and training for automobile mechanics in the province of Quebec. It's how the destabilization of existing modes of regulation leads to uncertainty, resilience, and strategic responses on the part of many different actors, and ongoing organizational and institutional experimentation, and how these experiments open up new strategic spaces, but are also constrained by existing institutional legacies. Now, the case of Quebec is a similar one to the one that Cassie was talking about, Aerospace, with an additional complexity. You really have this dense, multipartite institutional ecosystem for wages, working conditions, and training. And the extra bit in relation to what Cassie was talking about is that it's also an industry which is subject to collective agreement extension, or what we call decrees for some trades, of which auto mechanics in many, but not all regions, through joint industry labor management committees. So these bodies engage in minimum wage fixing, inspection, skill certification, and training for skills exams, but there's a neoliberal erosion of their efficacy. You also find, similar to what Cassie said, these sectoral and national training strategies with multi-stakeholder industry committees responsible for skill diagnostics and training overviews. And you also have in Quebec an odd situation where you can be an automobile mechanic and do the work without being qualified in the trade. And this varies from one province to another in Canada. So it's a voluntary system in Quebec. And this leads to multiple problems of skill shortages, skill gaps, which Mathieu will talk about, and how the industry is experiencing significant pressures because of the impact of technology on the business models and also on the skills. And you have multiple actors seeking to address these uncertainties across a quite fragmented and multi-levered environment. Now, if we go to how the industry was, it was one of profitable dealerships focused on vehicle sales, leaving scope for robust secondary market. It's an industry of very small enterprises, and they kind of got along quite well because there was a clear division of labor, and access to technology was not an issue. The skills in the workforce, weak technological requirements, different skill profiles, the attractiveness of the profession, mechanics for mechanically minded school leavers, historic improvement of wages and benefits through unionization, and some of the transfer of these gains to the non-union sector, the abundant labor supply. And there was this division of labor between the variety of institutions, multi-partite committees, including school boards with their own logic for production to change in response to employers' demands. Now, the fault lines of disruption, I think that they're clear, and I won't spend time on this, simply say technology and climate change are combining to create this incredible pressure on the industry and the skills to service the industry. And they're also changing consumer and worker preferences here about how they want to work. Over to the next one. This has impacts on business models in terms of increased profitability pressures on dealers by original equipment manufacturers, the big car makers saying basically, you used to make money selling cars, now you have to make money servicing them, and that's what they didn't do in the past. This creates pressures in the aftermarket, which is the 75% of the work on cars takes place by banners and independent dealers because it costs less. But these independent dealers now need access to technology, which is rationed and costed by manufacturers and their proprietary technologies. Insurance companies put increased pressure from technology on the body shop sector. So you have all of this time, the access to technology, you have all the time whether the workers who are in it are actually have the skills to do this, whether there's sufficient supply of people working. And then just over to the last slide before I pass it over to you, Mathieu, which is there are various types of responses, increased concentration of dealerships in order to cope with competition and variability. Online technologies open up space for new types of vehicle sales and maintenance, and the greater long-term reliability also displaces some of the traditional profit centers and reduces scope for maintenance and repair. So what you've got is a perfect storm for many in terms of technology, competitive pressures, and the impact for skills. Over to you.
Yeah, so you have the general portrait of the institution and the business model. So what happens there's two impacts on skills. One of the main problem is shortages. So there's a general shortages in all trades. We don't have the clear figure because it's mainly done by surveys by employers, but still the parity committees, they did a survey recently, and 90% of workers will retire in 10 years or less. So that's another factor adding to the general labor shortages. There's also a labor shortage of workers with skills. So you only have in Quebec 25% of the workforce that has the basic entry qualification, which is called the DEP. So it's the initial vocational training. There's also freaking hiring of unskilled workers. The second impact on skill is gap. So there's a lack of basic skill to achieve certification as a skilled mechanic. So for example, there's a rate of failure of 50% or more on skill exam for journeyman qualification. There's also a big lack of skills, and especially because of technological disruption. So actual workers in the labor market, they don't have the basic skills. Yeah, there's this story about future skills. which might be a bit inflated, but there's also the basic skills of being able to read, calculate, and being able to understand electrical skills. Impact on work, actors, and institutions. So the regulatory framework, you have a genuine framework, but now there's a decline in the legitimacy of the decree system. It is not typical to the auto service sector. It's also a general tendency in Quebec of this decline of this decree system. For unionization, like Gregor said, it's mostly concentrated in the dealership, and there's no actual strategy to move beyond this situation. There's also a disconnection between the periphery community and the SMEs in the sectors. Everyone know that the minimum wages are a joke in decree. So you get this kind of disincentive to invest in skill where you have low tariff, low costs for operation, but also low wages. So time one, the experimentation. So there's clearly sources of uncertainty, competitive pressure, tech change, climate pressures, two major problems, skills shortages and skills gap. But nonetheless, the actors in the sector, they are interrogating their legacy right now, and they want to recalibrate their strategy to address those skills problems. Around skills shortages, there's several strategies that we identify. I will go really quickly. There's one to address the weak and declining enrollment in vocational training. So you have work-study apprenticeship. You have supervision for apprenticeship training, and partnership between vocational training center and manufacturing to improve learning infrastructure and technological capacity. There's also some program to recruit immigrants in different sectors, and especially in a region where the shortages are the most salient. Lastly, for the skill shortages, there's employer efforts also to dilute skill requirement for some new technology. So there are some employers that are pushing new types of skills, new types of person that will do the job that will be outside of the decree system. But the union and some institutions are fighting really hard to keep this job to be done by skilled worker and skilled technicians. Around skill gap, there's a lot of training initiative to have higher rates of qualification. You have also the try to move unqualified entrants toward qualification. Proliferation of training initiative. We always do the joke that this sector is characterized by the Chinese buffet of training initiative. There's lot of training from businesses, from institutions, from the parts distributors. So that's one of their experimentation to address skills gap. Upgrade also the vocational training. There's a sense that there's an inadequacy between the actual training system, basic training system, and what is required to perform the job. So there's some people that saying we should have new training for electrical vehicle, and also move maybe to a college level training as opposed to high school only, which is the actual basic training. What are the results? The experimentation right now is still in process. If we take the three categories in the CRIM project, so risk inequality, there's an incapacity to improve working condition to become more attractive. There's a vicious cycle between low wages, low rates charged by businesses, and ironically, the low investment in competent skills, which will be one of the key to address the problem of disruption right now. Control and autonomy, there's historically there was a lot of control and autonomy for workers. and especially they wanted to, if you wanted to move as a businessman to start your own garage. But technology is right now threatening this autonomy, and especially in the dealership where there's a close relationship between the OEMs and the shop. Concluding remark. So there's, despite huge problem and low investment in skill, there's a consciousness of part of multiple actors in the sector for the need to industry to change in regard to the sources of disruption that they're dealing with. Movement from traditional repertoire of action to experimentation, but there's ongoing tension observed in processes of experimentation. So there's a strong sectoral identity, multiple and creative example of institutional entrepreneurship, but there's some blockage right now where organizational experimentation are constrained by institutional legacy. And as we said, many times there's a suboptimal dynamics in the sector despite creativity. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, perfect. Once again, you guys are really keeping to the time limits, and it's allowing us to roll on. And so Ian and Mathieu, we can turn to you now and take it away. Thank you.
Okay, so I agreed to do the presentation, but Mathieu can answer your questions, especially the difficult ones. So I'm going to talk very briefly about our research on insourcing in the North American auto industry. You know, we thought that this would be experimentation for better work because it was something unions really wanted, and it reversed something that was causing worse work, namely the vertical disintegration trend in the Detroit 3 automakers. But it is a real question whether this has been an effective way to produce better work. So we wanted to explain why around the time of the last crisis, this trend towards vertical disintegration in these automakers kind of stalled. We wanted to understand the role of trade unions in it. So during the last crisis, there was a political media discussion of insourcing, but actually normally what people meant when they were talking about it was reshoring. So they were intrigued by the idea that work that was sent to low wage countries like China or Mexico would be brought back to the US or Canada. But this is not what we observed. We did see a few cases of these companies bringing externalized work in-house, but it was domestic. So we saw 8 entire auto plants that had been spun off, repurchased by the big 3 automakers. And this was a time when they were closing dozens and dozens of plants. 2 of these were in Canada and 6 of these were in the US. We came across 8 cases of insourcing particular production processes. The biggest example would be an entire axle, but also cutting process or other things. So there were 3 cases of this that we came across in Canada, 5 in the US. Also, insourcing of support functions such as maintenance and material handling. So we saw 8 cases of this as well, 5 in Canada and 3 in the US. And then we saw 3 cases of on-site outsourcing. So this is where work is done by a contractor, but it's unionized and on the premises of the big 3 plant. So we saw 1 case in Canada and 2 in the US. So as we were looking at these, we were kind of trying to figure out why. So if you look at a lot of studies about insourcing, it talks about the business case and uses a lot of ideas from transaction cost economics. So we looked at that. We looked at kind of the corporate politics and strategies of this, which can cut against the business case sometimes. And then we were interested in labor management relations, obviously, because we wanted to see how unions were affecting this. So we, and of course, there's a lot of literature saying that that labor management relations can affect both the politics and the business case of investment and sourcing. So the empirical research was done in much better times. Mathieu and I visited 23, well, we talked to trade unionists and managers who told us the stories of 23 plants, and it allowed us to visit places such as Ontario and Detroit and Dayton, Ohio, and Western New York and Nashville, Tennessee. And we looked at plants that had been produced parts within the big three, and some of them had remained in-house, some of them had been spun off, some of them had been spun off and re-internalized, some of them had just been closed. So we were interested in these plants that were kind of on the boundary of the firm, where we think there'd be an interesting, a lot of pressures and a lot of movement back and forth across the corporate boundary. We talked to trade unionists at Unifor and the UAW, and we also came across this small union that's a CWA affiliate called the International Union of Electrical Workers, which represents a lot of workers in auto parts plants in the Dayton, Ohio area. So we ended up identifying 27 cases, as I said, and 14 of these had an active union role in bringing the work in-house. So it was not, the work was not just being brought in-house because wages were low, but because trade unionists had pointed out that there was some work that could be profitably brought in-house. And in almost every case, they had also helped frame the business case for doing so. So this paper is all about how these trade unionists intervened in corporate politics. You know, one aspect of this is the business case. So on the one hand, in order to be part of the conversation, trade unionists have to make a business case. They can't just be emotional and militant. And, you know, there was a lot of discussion about kind of the right attitude, the kind of right facts to talk about. And, you know, there was a strong, there were a lot of aspects of the business case that they could talk about. So they were really interested in risk. And they like to talk about how Delphi and American Axle, when they were spun off, created huge costs for General Motors because a large supplier held the OEM hostage. So there was that. There was also a lot of talk of saving money by using machines and floor space and kind of assets. So the business case is not irrelevant, but the business case does not make itself. So trade unionists have to go lobbying, they have to attend lots of meetings in Detroit. And what I found really interesting was just how this business case, how it's calculated and the procedures through which it is made is subject to negotiation. And this has been negotiated in the master agreements since the 1990s. So it's more highly formalized in the US than in Canada, but in both cases there's how this is discussed is actually negotiated over. So how did trade unionists involve themselves in corporate politics? So this was not just making partnerships with local management. So they would have to go to Detroit, right? And the people they talked to in Detroit were not just labor relations managers. They were engineering, purchasing, product development. And there's a really interesting kind of temporal dimension to this. So trade unionists had to figure out when is the relevant decision made where I can get influence. Often it's 4 years in advance of the launch of a product. So they have to figure out when that is, and they have to get information in order to bid to bring product into their plants. So labor management relations, what I was expecting were plant level productivity coalitions between labor management with some local concession bargaining and some partnership in exchange for investment. And I was quite surprised what I saw. So Mathieu and I did see multi-tier concession bargaining in both countries, work rule changes to be more productive, benefits concessions. All of this had happened both in the US and Canada. And this did affect the business case. So the business case against insourcing was greatly weakened because of these concessions. And everyone talked about that. And there were 8 cases of labor management partnerships. So many of the trade unionists we talked to were very passionate about better communication with local management and being more reasonable than their predecessors. But I guess there are 2 things that surprised us. One of them is how much is decided in national bargaining. And it's not just the procedures through which the business case is calculated and negotiations take place in the plants. It's also decisions about investment. Particular investments are decided in the national agreements. Also, what surprised us was just how many of these cases did not have labor management partnership involved. We found, so 6 of our 14 cases were actually leverage, where insourcing was pursued by virtue of pressure tactics, lobbying, and all kinds of things that were not in the realm of labor management partnership. And the importance of leverage, I think, is reinforced when you look at the differences between the plants. So when you look at plants that are outside of these national framework, these master agreements, so the plants of the IUE or the independent parts plants, these trade unionists had not heard that insourcing was even a thing, much less having an idea about or a strategy of how to make insourcing happen. So being part of this big framework agreement within Unifor or the UAW was super important for getting the power resources that you needed to be part of the discussion to make the business case to pursue insourcing. So does this work to make work better? It's really hard to say because in the majority of cases where there's insourcing, the workers who are carrying it out are workers who are covered by concessionary deals. So they're unionized, but their terms and conditions are worse than core workers. So yeah, that's the paper in a nutshell, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ian. This was great. And I was about to tell you you had 1 minute and 50 seconds, and I didn't even need to do that. Thank you. So these are 3 great papers, and we don't have a discussant, so we can take some questions. I have a couple of questions that I can start out with, but I would love to hear from other people first. So do people have some questions to get out on the table?
I'll jump in. Andy Schrank and Josh Whitford have argued that industrial policy is back in the US. And by that, they primarily are referring to networks to promote innovation. And my reading is that this primarily concerns small business. So I wanted to connect the 3 papers by asking Mathieu in particular, because he's on both papers, but do you see any networks in the US that are concerned with workforce development or among sectoral development, particularly among manufacturing companies? countries. So do we have a very limited notion of what industrial policy is in the US? Or do we have anything even approaching the weak version that Cassie referred to in Toronto? What do you make of the return of any kind of networks in the US?
Great question. Why don't we, that's a big question, so why don't we get a few comments on that rather than go on to other questions? Who wants to jump in?
So Ron called on Mathieu, but because no one else is talking, I will talk. There was a big industrial policy decision that is relevant to our story, which was the bailout of General Motors and Chrysler, and you know, okay, but this is not a story of networks for progressive workforce development policies. This was really okay. It saved the companies by making it easier for them to get credit, but in exchange, there had to be deeper concessions because because politicians from the U.S. South who could veto this thought that it was unfair that workers in the North had better wages and working conditions than workers in the South. So the industrial policy dimension of this is actually pretty pernicious, in my opinion.
I mean, I can say something about the two Canadian clusters in terms of the industrial policy element. I mean, the big difference in the two cases, we had the obviously very weak attempts in the Toronto cluster. But what we tended to find was that it was very difficult for SMEs, even if there were policy initiatives in place to encourage them to innovate, to actually be able to participate, because they didn't have formal mechanisms to support that participation in the Toronto cluster. You didn't have the informal networks, you didn't have the resources that were available to build SME manager capacity. You know, it takes a lot of time and energy and human resource to participate in industrial policy initiatives, to try and shape what they look like, to try and access the information that you need to access. So even in Toronto, where people were participating, it was based on their own personal desire to give back to the community, desire to build something for the sector, or through the networks that they built themselves to try and participate in the organizations that do exist, rather than like a much broader participation. A lot of firms just weren't connecting at all, if that answers at all about your question.
If I can jump in. So my analysis is like, maybe I will play the institutionalist and say that policy innovation come from institutional constraints. If I compare the case that we observe in the auto manufacturing to auto services in Quebec, even if business are businesses in Quebec, you have institutions that constrain the action, and they have to talk to each other, and they can gather around a team and develop a policy, which was not the case in the US. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but most of our cases were made through the corporation. There was no any local productivity coalition with politicians and kind of like institution tool that were mobilized to insource work. So I think there's this dynamics of institution that really constrain the actors' strategies, and I think Gregor will have really nice things to say on this if he can pursue on my point about Quebec institutional thickness. Maybe it does not work, but at least there's a forum to develop those strategies.
Well, over to Gregor. Thank you, Mathieu. Not at all. I first, in reaction to Ron's question, I would add in environmental policy, because Quebec is the leading promoter of hybrid and electrical vehicles amongst Canadian provinces, is pushing it in a way that is destabilizing many employers who then have to invest in this, but find that they don't have the skill base in order to follow the push, which is coming from environmental policy, which is a feed over, you want to talk about industrial policy also being a service policy, so that the manufacturer is out front and they'll respond to the demand. And if there's a demand for electric and hybrid vehicles, being through strong state incentives and pushing a whole variety of actors, it's harder for the small and medium enterprises. And I pick up on Cassie's point that there's the question of capacity. That said, the people, and this is the institutional thickness, it's quite amazing how much time people in the Quebec industry spend talking to each other multiple times a week, constantly, in fact. So there's a lot of learning and there's a lot of reflection taking place over what they should be doing. But there's a suboptimal character because they don't have full institutional constraints. There's a lot of escape. So you can be an employer and not invest in training. I'd like the government to give me skilled workers that I need, but I don't want to invest in myself. And if you do get the qualifications, well, I'd actually like you to get another job because I'll then have to pay you too much. So you get into to some complex aspects here, but the institutional thickness, and I don't know that you would agree with this, Cassie, we tend to think it's better, and it certainly gives more voice, but it can also be constraining, that institutional thickness in the way it works. So it cuts both ways, but institutional thickness with industrial policy means that there's a lot of opportunity to experiment and to do things. I don't know whether I'm really responding to your point, Mathieu, but that's where I'm at.
Just to
Oh, go ahead, Cassie.
Just to briefly say that I agree with Gregor, institutional thickness doesn't mean something's positive or negative. It can make it harder to innovate, but it does create discursive spaces where actors can communicate and build trust relationships, which can support participation and involvement in industrial policy, I guess.
Great. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of things, really with my editor's hat on. So, how can you position these papers and the contributions they can make? The first thing is the first two papers are really about skills. And we've had waves of literature on skills and training. And so I think, and of course they keep on coming back with another round of new technologies, then there's another institutional lag in training, et cetera. But it would be really good to think about how you can position this. Is there something new here? What is your contribution to the literature? So for example, Cassie, I was thinking about Rick Locke's classic study comparing, the two auto plants in Italy, and the difference in the institutional frames that led to very different outcomes. So you've got this perfect match case comparison that is really rich. And I think you can really leverage that, particularly because it's two cities in the same country, even though French Quebec is obviously very different. So the one question I had, both papers, yours and Mathieu's and Gregor's, were talking about skill shortages, particularly in Montreal. And I wondered if you just didn't mention it about Toronto, or whether that's a critical difference that then would undermine a bit your case comparison. So I think you have to look carefully at, are there places where there are real differences in the environment that might undermine, that create alternative explanations for your argument. But this question of a skill shortage, why it exists and whether it exists in both places, I think is really, really important. And then for Gregor and Mathieu, same thing. I mean, there's this nice story about, technological disruption, experimentation, et cetera. And again, we've gone through waves of this. So how can you think about, is there something different about this new round of technology change? Is it that you're looking at a sector that people haven't looked at before? So what might you leverage in your study? And then for Mathieu and Ian, I thought this was really great. I mean, great data on a series of cases on insourcing and the shift to explanations in terms of corporate politics. There's, I think, pushing on this question of what's the business case is really interesting. And I want to refer you to Jessie Halpern Finnerty's article that she presented in these sessions on outsourcing in the food services industry. She's a grad student in Berkeley and Santa Cruz, and so I can hook you up. But she did her interviews and found that the business case for outsourcing was not based, the business case was not based at all on short-term cost or profitability, but was based on financialization. And that the the outsourcers were able to give loans to the universities in ways that allowed them to build new infrastructure. And then for the tech companies, it was that they wanted to reduce headcount so their profits per headcount looked better because they were about to do an IPO. So I'm just giving this as an example of how you might think about the parameters of the business case argument being more diverse or more hidden than we have classically thought of the business case in the past. And that might dovetail nicely with the work you're doing. And quickly, I know I'm out of town, but the other point is that I don't know whether you can leverage the Canadian-US comparison richly, but certainly if there are no differences, that's interesting, right? Because there are supposed to be deep institutional differences between Canada and the US. So if there are not, why not? Is the multinational corporation larger than the institutions, the local institutions, in ways that cancel out what we think of as being traditional differences that make a difference in these cases? So I think thinking hard about how you leverage the comparisons of the Canadian and US cases is important to think through, whether or not the institutions matter. So we still have 1 or 2 more minutes if someone wants to jump in, or you might want to respond to any of the last comments.
Since can I talk? So the financialization thing is interesting. So there's kind of quite a common fate for these plants that were spun off by the big three. They would change hands a couple times before being closed, or finally finding a proper auto supplier to run them, or being re-internalized by the big three. And we should really count this and quantify this, but quite a few of them ended up in the hands of private equity companies. And the biggest example is Delphi. And you know, here's an example of how financialization reinforces insourcing, because it was the private equity investors that held General Motors hostage and cost General Motors a lot of money by threatening to halt supplies to General Motors. So so that's something that we've been trying to figure out how to incorporate into our argument, but it does come up a fair amount. Mathieu can talk about US-Canadian comparison. I mean, you're right, it's surprising how similar they are. And in a way, the Canadians were less self-critical about all of this concession bargaining than the Americans were, because it was slightly newer with them. I think that was our feeling about it, but we didn't really talk about that in the paper.
No, but I will be quick. Will be really quick. I think there was when all the papers that compare the U.S. and Canadian auto union were made in a period where material conditions were really different for the two countries. Canada was in expansion and the U.S. was in downsizing. So it kind of framed our vision But since the crisis, I think the material condition for Canadian union are really shrink, and it gave a sense that they might have to change their strategy toward attracting investment. And I won't be that long because I think we're out of time, but anyone has other comments?
If I can just come in on this,
Yeah.
but if what's new, I think there are three things, Rose, and we're still trying to think of this because we're in the middle of this, doing interviews in the evening with auto mechanics with different kinds of classifications. Number one is the technology and the open and closed nature of the technology. I think that it simply moved on, and the control that the manufacturers exert over the access to the technology and their ability to commodify access to that technology changes the power relationships right down the line, so that how you as can have a garage that can fix someone's car, that changes. And it's also about skill and what you do about low skills, and the regulation of skills. In a place like Germany, there's no doubt everyone has to be qualified and do the apprenticeship and everything else. And then you have places in Canada where you do have to do that, and other places where you don't. But the technology, again, is changing to the degree that when you have features of a self-driving system, do you really want an unqualified person repairing your car? So this opens up big time a return to saying we must have across the board certification for some of these professions, which hasn't been the case. So do you want a cardiologist who hasn't been certified? Well, this is what's happening in auto mechanics with the introduction of all this self-driving technology. And I guess the third aspect, and it's quite different, is a lot of people look longingly at a decree system. In other words, this is one of the artifacts of Belgium of the 1920s and 30s, and the ability to extend collective agreements. And every time you have wishful thinking in the US about labor law, you say we need to be able to extend bargaining over into these new sectors. Well, this is actually what exists here. And it's quite interesting to look at the auto sector and to see how the decree system gets mixed in with skill provision and evolution of business models. So there's probably something useful on the labor law side and thinking about that, because it's often held up as a model of what we should be able to do. Here it's actually being done, and it's highly contested and being undermined from within.
Great. Great conversation, great papers, and I think we ought to get ready to hear the president.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Not Donald Trump, of Lira, right?
Of Vera.
Thank you all, and thank you, Rose.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
for your attention, and have a nice day.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Stan.